Story 1: The Flash Drive's Secret. It all started during my final year of college. I was in the student lounge one afternoon, trying to catch up on my digital design project. My laptop had crashed at home, and the software I needed, Maya, was only available on the campus computers. The lounge was mostly quiet, with a few students scattered around, but I noticed one computer open and available in the corner. As I walked over, I spotted a guy sitting at one of the desks. He was tall with pale skin, messy black hair, and a hoodie that read "Warrior Spirit" on the front. His jeans were torn, and he wore battered sneakers that looked like they'd seen better days. I recognized him from my psychology class, but we had never spoken. He wasn't really part of any group. He was the type of person who seemed to keep to himself, always with a distant, eerie vibe. I took a seat next to him, fumbling through my bag for my flash drive. The moment I sat down, he turned his head and glanced at me, his gaze sharp and unblinking. I froze for a second, not sure if I should speak or just ignore it. But then he spoke in a low voice, almost to himself. "You're here for the answers too, aren't you?" I wasn't sure how to respond. His words caught me off guard, so I just muttered, No, I'm just here to work on my project." He didn't reply, just kept staring at the screen in front of him. The silence between us was uncomfortable, and I quickly turned my attention to my work, hoping it would break the tension. But then I heard him chuckle a soft, unsettling sound. It was like he was laughing at something I didn't understand. I kept my head down, pretending not to notice. Trying to break the awkwardness, I said, "Yeah, they really pile on the homework, don't they?" He didn't answer, just stared at the screen. For a moment, I thought he might have heard me, but his gaze never shifted. I went back to focusing on my project, but I could still hear him mumbling quietly to himself, though I couldn't make out the words. I felt my heart rate quicken, a sense of unease creeping in. The whole situation felt wrong, like something was about to happen, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Then, just as quickly as he'd started, he stood up and walked out of the lounge, leaving his seat empty. I let out a quiet sigh of relief, but something caught my eye. His flash drive was still plugged into the computer. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. Part of me thought about just leaving it there, but another part of me felt like I should return it to him. After a few minutes, I decided to take it and give it back later. The lounge was about to close, so I figured I could return it tomorrow before class. But when I got home that night, I completely forgot about it and tossed it into a drawer. The next day, I remembered and thought it was the perfect time to give it back to him. But when I opened the drawer to grab it, I was struck by an odd curiosity. I plugged the flash drive into my laptop, figuring I'd just see what was on it and erase anything unnecessary. Norton ran a quick scan, and everything seemed fine. But something about it felt off, like I was missing something. I opened the first folder labeled Design, figuring it was filled with school-related files. But when I opened it, I was stunned. It was a full set of completed projects for every assignment we'd done in class. They were all perfectly formatted and had far more detail than what we were ever assigned. I wondered if this was some kind of bizarre study aid, but it felt more like a warning. Next, I opened another folder titled Music. Inside were only 3 songs: Karma Police by Radiohead, Black Hole Sun by Soundgarden, and The Man Who Sold the World by David Bowie. It felt like the kind of playlist someone would put together for a dark, introspective mood. I didn't know what it meant, but I couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of dread as I listened to a few seconds of each. I kept going, and the next folder I found was titled Psychology 101. I thought it would be some random notes, but when I opened it, There were hundreds of pages of typed notes, his name, written over and over again. It was like a personal journal, with entries detailing his thoughts on everything from dreams to fears. It was deeply unsettling. The next folder had no name, just a strange symbol to intersecting triangles. Inside, there were strange photographs. One was a picture of the campus emergency evacuation plans, marked with red X's over specific rooms in the buildings. Another photo showed a dark alleyway near campus with a cigarette butt on the ground. There were more photos of strange, cryptic symbols drawn in the margins of old textbooks. And then there was a photo of me, taken from a distance, sitting at my desk in the library, reading a textbook. It was taken at a time when I was sure no one had been near me. I couldn't stop scrolling, even though every image and file was pushing me further into a state of panic. And then I found it, a file named Goodbye, but when I opened it, it was completely blank. I had no idea what to make of any of this. Was it some kind of sick joke? Or had he known something was going to happen? Maybe he had just gone through a dark phase and disappeared. Maybe he had left because he realized he lost his flash drive. Or maybe there was something else at play. But as I sat there, staring at the files, I realized one thing: there was no way I could ignore what I had found, and it has haunted me ever since. Story 2: The Closet Lurker. In my room, next to my bed, was a large storage closet. It didn't have the usual door you might expect. It was more of a large square with no handle, just a piece of wood that slipped into place when you pushed it against the frame. Rewind to several months ago when I was still 22. I remember the first time it happened. I went to bed one night and woke up in the morning to find that the door had fallen open and was resting against the edge of my bed. This wasn't too strange, as it had happened before. After all, there were no hinges to keep it in place. I pushed the door back and went about my day, but the next night, something was different. Around a.m., I awoke to a strange noise. I sat up in the dark, looking around, and I saw the door was once again leaning against my bed. This time, I felt a sense of unease. I figured the edges of the hole in the wall were starting to chip, and that the door no longer fit properly. I left it open for the rest of the night and planned to fix it the next morning. The following night, I couldn't fall asleep. I tossed and turned for what felt like hours when I suddenly heard a loud thud. It was the door falling open again. Frustrated, I decided I'd just leave it open from now on. But that's when I heard something strange, like the faint rustling of a plastic bag. My heart skipped a beat. There wasn't any breeze in the room, so this couldn't have been the wind. I hesitated for a moment, then flicked on the light. The closet was open wide, and standing inside was a figure, looking right at me from the shadows. My stomach dropped. The person quickly tried to hide, as though I hadn't seen them. I froze for a moment, too terrified to move. Then I screamed out, "Dad!" My voice echoed in the room as my heart raced. My dad rushed in, and it felt like forever before he finally reached my room. I pointed to the closet, and he immediately went inside to check. But when he came back out, he said there was no one there, and that I was probably imagining things. I began to doubt myself. Still, I couldn't bring myself to sleep in that room. I ended up on the floor in my parents' room, clutching a blanket, but even then, sleep wouldn't come. Before I could even settle, I heard the sound of my bedroom door creaking open from down the hall. Moments later, I heard footsteps running down the stairs, followed by the front door slamming shut. My parents heard it too. We rushed downstairs, but whoever it was had already run off. It was only then that my parents truly believed me. We called the police, and when they investigated the closet, they found an empty container hidden deep inside. That discovery left me with one cold, hard truth. Someone had been hiding there. I could never go back into that room again without feeling like something or someone was still lurking in the shadows, waiting. Story 3. Whispers from the Closet.
When I was 11 years old, we lived in an old, creaky house that always felt too big for just the three of us. My room was unique. It had its own floor, separated from the rest of the house. It wasn't even meant to be a bedroom. It was more of a large closet or a storage room that the previous owners had turned into a playroom for their daughters. I remember the walls still had faint traces of where the colorful wallpaper had once been peeled away, leaving a faded, slightly peeling surface that seemed to watch me. The most unsettling part of the room was the closet. It wasn't like an ordinary closet. It was enormous and elevated, with a set of wooden steps leading up to it. The sliding doors were heavy and creaked loudly whenever they were moved. Inside, the closet was packed with old toys, stuffed animals, and other relics of my childhood that we'd shoved in there to keep the room tidy. But I hated it every time I stepped into the room. I felt like the closet was more than just a place to store things. I could never shake the feeling that something or someone was watching me from inside. One night, after a particularly scary movie with my family, I was lying in bed, still shaking from the images playing in my mind. I buried myself under my blanket, trying to block out the eerie silence of my room. That's when I heard a faint, unmistakable sound of something rolling across the wooden floor of the closet above. It wasn't just the house settling or the wind. It was deliberate, like a toy being moved. I froze, my heart racing, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But the sound came again, louder this time. Panic surged through me, and I bolted out of bed, sprinting down the stairs to my parents' room. I shook my mom awake, tears streaming down my face as I tried to explain what I'd heard. My dad grumbled in the background, clearly annoyed at being woken up. "It's nothing, just the house creaking," he said, waving me off. But my mom saw how terrified I was and let me sleep in their room that night. The next day, things felt normal again. I started to believe maybe it really had been my imagination. But then, that evening, it happened again. I was just about to drift off to sleep when I heard it, the unmistakable clatter of a container of Legos tipping over. The sound of the tiny plastic pieces scattering across the closet floor made my blood run cold. This wasn't my imagination? The following day, I couldn't let it go. I convinced my mom to check the closet with me. Together, we climbed up the wooden steps, the air in the room feeling heavy and still. As she slid open the creaky door, we saw it, a container of Legos spilled across the floor, just like I'd heard. My heart sank. This was proof someone had been there. But my mom brushed it off, saying the container must have been unsteady and tipped over on its own. "See?" she said, trying to sound reassuring. "There's nothing to be afraid of." That night, my dad had enough. He locked his bedroom door, telling me I needed to learn to sleep in my own bed. "You're imagining things," he said firmly. "It's time to stop this nonsense." I was terrified. The thought of being alone in that room with a closet looming over me was almost too much to bear. I lay in bed that night, completely still, listening to the silence of the house. My imagination ran wild with every creak and groan of the old floorboards. I kept staring at the closet door, waiting for something to happen. Hours seemed to pass, and I started to think maybe tonight would be different. And then it happened. The silence was shattered by the deep, grinding sound of the closet's sliding door being forced open. My breath caught in my throat as I saw it illuminated by the pale moonlight streaming through my window, a dark figure standing at the top of the wooden steps, just inside the closet. It was tall and shadowy, its features obscured, but it was undeniably human. Pure terror consumed me. I couldn't even scream at first. My voice caught in my chest. But as the figure stepped forward, climbing down the steps toward me, I let out a scream so loud and raw it seemed to shake the walls. The figure froze for a moment as if startled by the noise, then bolted leaping off the steps and running out of my room, down the stairs, and out the front door. By the time my parents reached my room, I was a trembling mess, barely able to speak. My dad ran downstairs, grabbing a bat from the closet, and stormed outside, but whoever it was had already vanished into the night. The police were called, and they searched the area, but they never found the man or any trace of him. For years, I couldn't sleep in that room again. Even after we moved out of that house, the memory of that figure standing in my closet still haunts me. I'll never forget the feeling of pure, unexplainable terror that night,